Everyone. I am honored to join the Law and Mental Health Conference on alternatives to police and to learn from all of the presenters. Thank you to the Mental Health Association of Portland for organizing this and for inviting me. My name is Kaia Sand. I'm the executive director of Street Roots, which is a weekly newspaper sold in Portland, Oregon by people experiencing homelessness and poverty in order to earn income. And we're part of an international network. Here in North America, there are street newspapers in Montreal, in Mexico City, in Boston, Denver, Cleveland, Seattle, Vancouver, and Street Roots in Portland, Oregon, and many other cities. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out sort of the advocacy path that our organization, Street Roots, undertook to get a non-police first responder system in Portland Street Response that responds to street crises at this point with a medic and a crisis worker. And it's my hope that that I'll be able to describe some of the particular ingredients that led to this. And what I'm thinking is that some of this is going to be really transferable to other cities, and some of it is just really going to be about political opportunities and timing in Portland. But my hope is also that that's useful, because I think for us at Street Roots, we've found that oftentimes we have to be very selective about what advocacy we take on and really strategic in terms of timing and political opportunities. So before I just jump in more of a chronological way to sort of chart out how this advocacy took place, I want to just summarize a few key factors. And the first one is that we have had a model. We're in Portland, Oregon, and we have had a model, 100 miles to the south of us, in Eugene, Oregon, and that's Cahoots. And so people in Portland have pointed to that for years. Cahoots is a blueprint. They also are incredibly generous with supporting other cities trying to get this going. And so that has really been a key factor. The second key factor that I just want to mention is that we had in 2018, that's when I'm going to start kind of charting out this timeline. We had a newly elected, actually she began in the beginning of 2019, a newly elected city commissioner, Joanne Hardesty, and she campaigned on basically this idea that turned into Portland Street Response. And she brought a community organizing ethos into the office to really build support. And we were able to work with her on that. And that was a second really key factor in being able to get this going. A third piece is that there are a lot of people in our Portland City government that were also really ready to get this going. And this ranged from, Bob Causey, the director of the Bureau of Emergency Communications, which is over the 911 system. In the fire department, Tremaine Clayton was someone that our organization already knew, and he was really, tied into Cahoots and would go down and volunteer with Whitebird, which is the organization over Cahoots in Eugene. And he was a firefighter who was quite visionary. And then now Chief Sarah Boone was always really on board. And then she became chief a little ways into the implementation, and that's been really key. A fourth area I would say that was really in terms of all the political opportunities is some key media efforts, and I'm going to mention them. An article investigation by the Oregonian in Portland, an investigation by the Willamette Week, and then our own paper, Street Roots, played a particular role, and that'll also chart out. And then fifth, and this is really where I can speak from in particular, is that structure of Street Roots. We're kind of in a unique position to play a kind of outside role with a little bit of inside in order to get this program going. And that's because we are a newspaper over 2 decades old. We also work with people directly every day who are experiencing homelessness. And that has been really key. And we engage in advocacy. And I would say I put three fingers because I see this as a kind of triangulation that we're constantly aware of, like which part of that triangle really matters to this effort at this moment. And so I say it's a kind of nimbleness to which we bring dogged attention. So I'm going to jump in and just talk a little bit about the history that got us to where we are. I'm not going to get so much into the actual program where it's at right now, as much as that advocacy effort to shepherd it. So with Street Roots, with the organization that I direct, we have for our entire 22-year history been addressing the criminalization of homelessness. And so that could be anywhere from when, sleeping outside is made illegal in a city, to the ways in which fines and fees target people who are unhoused. And I would say there are multiple reasons why this is really a focal point for us. One of them is just that all of these ways in which people get entangled in the legal system create barriers to housing and employment. So it's really counterintuitive in a lot of ways, right? Our entire system is structured actually to make it harder for people who are very, very poor to get employed or to get into housing. And we see, we're constantly working with people that they end up facing these legal entanglements precisely because they are homeless. And so it just piles up. And in addition to the fact that these legal entanglements create barriers to housing and employment, it also, as we all know, again and again, can lead to actually to death. And that is something that our organization is particularly attuned to. For the past 8 years, we have issued with the county, Multnomah County in the Portland area, a death report. That's an important part of our advocacy, is to really track how people die on the streets. And we know that when people experiencing homelessness, mental health struggles, confront police, that it can end up with fatal consequences. So all of that was informing what we were thinking about in terms of why we would jump into something like this. And I would say that I'm going to share some elements with you on the screen right now. I would say that actually, it's the stories. It's like we share the same coffee pot in our office. People are selling the paper. People are writing the paper. People are doing advocacy. So we're always having conversations. And, I think about one man who he would tell me, he would have kind of outbursts on the streets from his mental health struggles, and homelessness made it just so much harder. And he would tell me essentially his brain would itch. And what he needed when his brain itched, because sometimes he'd be shouting and maybe it would seem scary to someone who didn't know him, but what he needed was a soothing voice. And we had a vendor, Chris Beck. I pulled up one of our pieces in our paper. It's a print paper, but we also post everything online. And Chris Beck was really always thinking about these ideas. And this was the summer of 2018, where she described for our paper, coming upon is an incident on 10th and Jefferson in Portland. And there were all these police officers that were surrounding someone who was in mental health crisis. And it was so powerful to me. She said, I could have handled her myself. I could have calmed her down. And I am 5'3". They just freaked her out more. Why not have a mental health unit that can respond? And that is something we saw over and over again too. It's just this over response, right? Of police officers that would have the sirens and tower over people experiencing homelessness. And one of the things that in this lead up, this would be the fall of 2018, that really stood out on a personal level for me was we had one of our Street Roots vendors, that's what we call people who sell the paper, come to our office in mental health crisis. And he was just really beside himself and saying some pretty using pretty violent speech. We knew him well, so I wasn't worried about our safety. But he was pulling rocks out of his pocket, and he was just, saying, "This is all I have, these rocks." And he was really just really coming undone. And we called the mental health responder, but we knew from what our paper covered and on our own responses that the majority of the time they would bring police accompaniment, and that's indeed what they were going to do. And I remember that hour so vividly, because I was afraid that this man would say something violent, make a reach for something like one of his rocks or anything else, and that he would get shot. So it was that fear, right, that he would do something that would make it seem as though he was going to act violently. So I was trying to disarm him myself before they came, make sure he didn't have any knives, clear his pockets, all of that. And I was just thinking, gosh, I'm the director of a newspaper. I am not really the person that should have to be doing all this. This is the system we have, where I always use the example of librarians, right? Like the librarians are having to de-escalate situations. People working at a newspaper are having to de-escalate situations. And oftentimes it's actually so that something bad doesn't happen because there's an encounter with the police. So that all brings us to 2018 in the summer, when the Oregonian issued a report June 27, 2018, that the year before, 2017, the majority of police arrests were of unhoused people. And specifically, it was 52%. And at that moment, it really shifted things. It's something we knew anecdotally, but they had done the data analysis, and people all over the city now knew this information, that actually the majority of arrests, 52%, were of unhoused people. Now, I say that it was kind of accumulation of media work. And one of the follow-ups to that was actually, I'm going to skip ahead to January and then skip back a little bit, but that is a report from the Willamette Week, which is another weekly paper in Portland. And they looked at 911 calls. And one of the things that they noticed was that the majority of these 911 calls were actually about these disorder calls, and the disorder calls lumped together a bunch of non-criminal matters, and that's really key. So they're all, the majority of their operators' calls to 911 were non-criminal matters, welfare checks, unwanted person calls. And a lot of these were unhoused people. I went and sat with them and listened to their calls, and I was blown away. This is what they're feeling. This is what they're dealing with. Every 15 minutes is what the Willamette Week showed. Every 15 minutes, they were responding to an unwanted person call, meaning, and it's really brutal language. And that's the code, meaning I want this person to go away. It's not a criminal issue. I just want them to go away. And that's really what we had found in a lot of those arrest calls too. They were really these low level things, right? But what would happen is that people would get arrested, and then they would, maybe they wouldn't show up for court dates. They wouldn't pay their fines. All those different things would accumulate because people are overwhelmed, living on the streets. I'd see so many people, they just crumple up a citation because they knew they couldn't pay it. They knew that their life would be too much about survival to be able to manage it. And then, they get their warrants and then they get arrested, and it gets harder and harder and harder. So I'm going to skip back to November of, or excuse me, I guess it was December of 2018. And our paper, Street Roots, did an article, an interview with then Chief Danielle Outlaw. She's now the police chief of Philadelphia. And in that interview, she said that the police did not want to be responding to these kinds of calls, that they knew that it actually wasn't effective to have it be the police. Well, we seized upon that. We were like, okay, we got the police chief. She's saying it. We know it. She's saying it. So right after that, our paper then published an editorial calling for this kind of alternative. So again, using the force of media to do it. And, this was, I think, the key sentence that that I still always hold on to. Not every call has a criminal nexus, and in fact, may require a skill set and a presence that specifically does not involve a badge and a gun. Does not involve a badge and a gun. So we knew, okay, we're building towards something. So then over the next months, one of the things that we did was I went down, let me see if I can pull that up. I went down and I went to Cahoots in Eugene, and I did a ride along. And I think, do I have it? Yep. So I wrote a column out of this. This is the Cahoots, one of the Cahoots teams that I wrote along with Amy May and Manning Walker. And it was so powerful. There's just a lot of examples that you'll hear from, I'm sure, different speakers. But one of the big things that I learned riding along is it was sort of the opposite of what oftentimes first responders have to be dealing with, where they're maybe having to just move so quickly. With Cahoots, what they were teaching me is actually it's about listening, right? And not just listening, but as they described it, it's the story beneath the story. The story beneath the story. So that, I rode along with them, and there was a man, someone had called, it was basically a kind of unwanted person type of call. And he was acting out on a corner. And they first found out he had an untreated wound. So they just treated the wound, right? Wound care. And then the second thing, just by listening for the story beneath the story, was that he also had cancer, and he didn't have a way to get to cancer treatment. And so, of course, he was in distress, and he just, didn't have the logistical way to solve it. So they simply drove him to his cancer appointment, listening to the story beneath the story. And that was just such a kind of light bulb for me in terms of the shift that we needed. For instance, when I thought of that man I described earlier with all the rocks in his pockets, it's just being with him, right? Being with him, hearing the story beneath the story. So on March 15th, 2019, our paper then published a special edition where we named a possible plan, a possible new program for Portland. We called it Portland Street Response. And our reporter, Emily Green, at the time had really laid that out and laid out what this would look like, just a very logistical model, like how much we thought it would cost, the kinds of, the numbers of vans, the partner agencies, all of these things, just to be like, here, city, here's a plan. Why don't you take it and run with it? But of course, when I mentioned before that we always are focused on triangulating, right? That we're focused on, what is the most important tool that we can use. We've got our newspaper, we have all the people we work with, and we have the advocacy. And that's when we shifted more into that campaign mode. So we shifted from the paper to the campaign, and we just started pushing it out. And I write a weekly column. So I was trying to count how many columns I've written about Portland Street Response. I lost count at 25. So you can tell that it's been a little bit of a, let's just say I feel very tenacious about it. But we, our street roots vendors experiencing homelessness really got involved, and they started going to city council budget meetings because we were right in the heat of the budget time. We were working with Commissioner Joanne Hardesty's office, and it was just go time. We were just letting all our readers, all our supporters know. And it's just an idea that's time had come. So many people had talked about it in Portland already, right? Like this wasn't that we were inventing something new. We had it at Cahoots. We had all these people that wanted it to happen. We just need to coalesce, build. We were able, Commissioner Hardesty put forward in the budget. At that point, it was just $500,000 to get a pilot going, and it passed. And this was such a huge victory. after that, what we started doing is working with the city on developing that pilot. And this was a really important shift. Again, this was kind of a community organizing point. So I started working with the community organizer in Commissioner Hardesty's office on a kind of community outreach plan. And what we did is started doing interviews and listening sessions. Commissioner Hardesty went to them. Tremaine Clayton, who is the firefighter who is now a leader in Portland Street Response, listening to unhoused people. And then what we did, and this has become a model for Street Roots, actually, we have built on this in the years since, we worked with a number of other organizations dealing with homelessness, a lot of grassroots organizations, and our Street Roots vendors went out with some Portland State researchers, hit the trails, went out to camps, and started interviewing people. They interviewed 184 people experiencing homelessness to start to design a plan for what people on the streets wanted for Portland Street Response. So we had done kind of that logistical model. They were going further, and we created a plan, or a report called Portland, Believe Our Stories and Listen, which was a quote from one of the people that we interviewed. And so some of the key pieces that we learned were, number one, and these are all, by the way, just premises that we hold to, Portland Street Response needs to be completely separate from the police. And we are always focused on this because that's one of those areas that can slip at any moment. It needs to prioritize mental health, de-escalation, trauma, and listening. Again, this was coming right from the streets. This is what people were saying on the streets. Portland Street Response should not be armed, should not run warrant checks. And part of this is the trust building, right? People, if they know that they're going to have a warrant check or that they could confront a gun, they're not going to have that same kind of relationship. Portland Street Response should have uniforms that are recognizable, distinct from other first responders. That they were hoping to get referrals right to other services, as well as transportation systems, like that story I told about Cahoots, where the person was taken to their medical appointment. And then that as much as possible as we build, Portland Street Response is about the crisis response. How do we keep then having places for people to go? And then the larger community needs to be educated about emergency calls. This is, again, coming from people on the streets. They know that people misuse 911. You recall the description I told you about in terms of the unwanted person calls coming in every 15 minutes, so-called unwanted person calls. And then this, and I love this, right? Treat people with compassion and dignity. One person said, I would like to see Street Response be the city's first response in dealing with the homeless crisis. I want Street Response to be the city's compassion. So that was really, really important in terms of us learning what it is, building toward this model for the city. And again, we're doing this all as an outside organization, but we're working with the inside at this point. So we actually did a press conference that September 2019 with Commissioner Hardesty, with Fire, with the Mayor Ted Wheeler, who has by and large supported, at certain points, pulled back in terms of supporting funding. So we're always pushing on him. So that was a really key part of moving toward this. And then by November of 2019, the city funded the pilot to go forward, brought in more money, and the pilot was under Portland Fire and Rescue. And then COVID hit. So that did slow things down a bit. But what happened during that time, I would say, is it was a slower rollout. But they were able to build out this program, and they had their crisis workers and their medics working in Lents, which is a particularly hard hit neighborhood. It's a diverse neighborhood. It was a really important one. There's a lot of stress in the neighborhood between some housed neighbors and unhoused neighbors. And so some of it was the community building with the housed neighbors as well as unhoused neighbors. So that was building during that time. And Street Roots' role is we had that kind of watchdog. And that's one thing I really want to emphasize, when I'm talking about this kind of trajectory of advocacy, and the particular role that we have played as a newspaper advocacy and working with unhoused people, shoulder to shoulder, is that how I see our role is one of kind of tenacity and clarity around what we think this should be in an organizing model, and so that we can always be pushing for course corrections. So if we think things are going off track, then we are loud and we are pushing. So the tenets that I think about in terms of how we push for those course corrections are that it has to be big enough to be successful, right? Like it can't be underfunded. It can't be just done in a small way so that it doesn't really meet needs. And then of course people are discouraged all over the city. So it's big enough to be successful. It has to be nimble enough to be successful. In other words, the Portland Street Response need to be able to adjust to the actual needs of people on the streets, whether it is they need that ride to the cancer appointment, right? Like what are the actual needs? Because we were experiencing too often when we couldn't get help in our own organization because it didn't fit kind of the more rigid criteria. And then we were left to deal with it on our own. And that inflexibility would really tank an effort. So big enough, nimble enough, completely separate from the police. And this is something that demands our continual watchfulness, is to be completely separate from the police. Now, during this time, there have been some key, I'd say, tragic moments. There's been a number of police shootings and folks experiencing mental health crises, but one of them was in the area where the pilot is, and it was a man named Robert Delgado, who some of our Street Roots vendors who are doing outreach work met. And so that was, it's outside the hours of the pilot. And I think it was one of those moments, incredibly tragic. And also, I think always those moments demand that we look at them and think, how could that have ended up differently? Now, I should say that our ongoing role, we have another ongoing role, just like we did that survey, Believe Our Stories and Listen. Our Street Roots vendors now are working with Portland State to do an ongoing evaluation of Portland Street Response. That was something Commissioner Hardesty really pushed for, and I think it's really smart for any city. We've done it the whole pilot, and now in March, Portland Street Response will go citywide, and that will continue. So it's a way of talking to a lot of people to continually evaluate and adjust, right? Adjust. Our folks talk to people experiencing homelessness. So that's the role that we play. And I'll say just, one final thing now is that I feel like if we ever were to withdraw from this, then I don't want to give like our organization too much credit, but what I mean is if anyone who really cares about seeing it through withdraws, then, it risks, there's risk with that, right? So for instance, right now there's a very big money, dark money campaign going on in Portland that's really about ratcheting up police and about, I would say some of the early polls that they're doing indicate that they're about rounding up people and making sure they go into shelters, people for Portland. And they actually put a poll out, misrepresenting Portland Street Response as this body that takes people to shelters. Now, they can, but that's not their primary role. And they were putting out there the idea that Portland Street Response would be used in an unarmed police role. In other words, Portland Street Response could be used to force people to go to shelters. Well, that is a no-go. That breaks trust. So I wrote a column, we start to shine a light on that. And I thought about how, I've said the whole time this has to be big enough, nimble enough, separate from the police. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a fourth direction I didn't see coming. They're arguing it should be de facto police. Clearly no. So again, we have to continue to be nimble in order to respond. But, there's so much at stake. And I'm so excited to just see the kind of momentum all around our country. And I think that in each instance, whether someone, is working within the structure or outside through advocacy models, community organizing models, sort of like we all have this area that we can pitch in. And so I've just been really honored to be able to, I guess, be alive and working on this at the moment in which the timing and political opportunity was there to do so. And I'll just conclude by saying, it's always ultimately about the people who are in crisis. And when I think about the kind of brutality that people end up suffering because they're again and again and again targeted when they have the least in society, it's the least we can do as a society to change that system. Thank you very much.